Greetings to all, and welcome to our final session of the day. I'm Sonia Gibbs, Managing Director of Global Policy Initiatives and Head of Sustainable Finance here at the IIF. A couple of quick housekeeping notes. Just a reminder to use our IIF meeting app, where you can find the agenda, speaker bios, and a way to submit questions, which we hope you will. You'll also find us in the App Store under IIF Meetings app. And before we start our discussion, please also note that this event is on the record and the audience does include members of the press. So with that, our topic here today is debt relief, and we've titled this panel, Is Now the Time for a Debt Moratorium? Increasingly clear that some of the world's poorest countries, including those eligible for concessional financing from the World Bank's International Development Association, or IDA, are finding debt service payments challenging but almost impossible as the economic impact of COVID-19 unfolds. Clearly, this is a very topical set of issues this week in the wake of the G20 and the Paris Club calls for a suspension of debt service for those poorest countries, and the calls for a coordinated approach, including all official bilateral creditors and private creditors on comparable terms. For a closer look at these issues, the G20's put out a term sheet in its communiqué. One interesting feature is that this suspension amounts to a refinancing or rescheduling rather than a restructuring, and that it doesn't affect the value of the asset. So in net present value terms, the suspension is meant to be NPV neutral. Just before we dive into this debate on the merits of a moratorium, I wanted to just give a few data points on the scope of the problem that we're talking about. So the 76 countries eligible for IDA funding represent about 2.5% of global GDP, but have more than 20% of the world's population, so very low GDP per capita. Many of these countries have been through previous rounds of debt relief, including under the HIPC and MDRI initiatives, and many have seen external debt levels rise again in recent years, on average by 10 percentage points, to over 45% of GDP, which is quite high for countries at that stage of development. And finally, just on the $35 billion in external debt service that's public or publicly guaranteed coming due this year, available data suggests that about 80% of that is owed to official sector lenders, split about evenly between official bilateral creditors and the multilaterals, and the remaining 20% to the private sector, split about 60% bondholders, 30% banks, and 10% other private creditors. So this raises an interesting set of questions for our wonderful panelists. Is a debt moratorium a good idea? Should it just be for the poorest countries? Debt workout negotiations are always complex. Can we make it simpler? And what are the consequences for at-risk sovereign borrowers and financial markets if we don't get it right? So luckily, we have with us a wonderful set of panelists, world-class expertise to talk us through it. And I'm very pleased to introduce Dave Lovinger, who is Managing Director, Emerging Markets Group at TCW. Vera Songwe, who is United Nations Under-Secretary General and Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Africa. And Dan Zelikow, is Vice Chairman at JP Morgan. Thank you very much to all of our panelists for joining us today. Vera, I wanted to start with you here. You've spent a long time sounding the alarm on the crisis-fighting measures needed for Africa. We've also seen a proposal from African finance ministers for suspension of debt payments. Now, how do you see the economic and social and political situation evolving for some of these vulnerable countries?
Thank you, Sonia. Thanks for having me at the IIF conversation. Hello, David, Dan. Listen, we are facing, I think, unprecedented times. We've never seen this before. It's been a century since we had a pandemic, and a very long time since there's been a global recession and a pandemic at the same time. So you can imagine that for the global world, we are still in shock. And I think for many of the emerging market countries, and in particular the African countries for which I speak today, there has been almost a sudden stop. I think while we have seen the coronavirus affecting the developed economies before it affects their economies, what we are seeing on the continent is that our economies are in standstill even before we begin to get the novel coronavirus. On the continent today, we're at about 15,000 total cases. And so just compared to some of the numbers that we have in Europe or the United States, 15,000 is really not that much. The death toll is about 589, 600 if you round them up. But what you're seeing is a total freezing of all the service sector. 51% of Africa's GDP is the service sector: tourism, airports, transport, logistics. Of course, with the fiscal distancing clauses that have been imposed, all that is frozen. We are estimating, and I think that the numbers have been verified by the IMF Africa Department. Africa was growing at 3.2%. We're supposed to go up to 4%. 3.2% already is not enough because of our population growth. When we grow at 3.2%, we actually are not adding any value into our economies. We needed to be growing at 2 digits. Now with this crisis, if it hits us in a mild fashion, which seems to be what so far we're going towards, except for some of the 5 big countries, we will see growth dip to 1.8%. We haven't seen this even in the 2008 crisis. Growth didn't dip that low. So this is the magnitude of the economic crisis that the continent is facing. It really is a sudden stop for all economic activity. There's no revenue coming in. Already on the continent, many countries' revenue to GDP was quite low at 18.4%. It's going to go even lower. Those that were doing well are also suffering. And actually, those that were doing well are suffering even more, because precisely it's these sectors of the economy that have been doing well where we are seeing a hit. The airline sector, $4.4 billion of loss, $6.2 million people out of a job. The tourism sector, all through South Africa, through Egypt, through Tunisia, frozen. No work is happening. I think there's only 2 sectors where we see some activity. That's the ICT sector, because we're having these conversations through an ICT medium, and so those activities are continuing. But that's a very small sector. 27% of Africans have access to the internet and can actually interact through this medium. Food supplies are beginning to become, there's a shortage because of an interruption in the global supply chains. So not only are we dealing with the existing people who are already undernourished on the continent, but we're dealing with a new set of undernourishment. What is going to happen is with scarcity, you see inflation, exchange rates, 20% depreciation already of the South African rand. So I think the novel coronavirus has not yet really hit the continent, but the economic impact across the continent has been already quite severe. And we hope really indeed that it doesn't last too long, because the consequences could be quite dire. That is why precisely we are calling for a standstill, just for us to take in the shock. This really is, when you get a shock, you need a little bit of a moment to say, what do we do now? Because we were hoping in East Africa, where I'm sitting in Ethiopia, we were growing at 8%. Kenya was growing at 7%. Uganda was growing at 7.5%. But all of that is stopped. We can't send Ugandan flowers to the Netherlands anymore because there is no logistics and transportation. The Rwandan women cannot send their coffee to China anymore for sales. They were doing that on electronic platforms. The electronic platforms are open, but the physical logistics are closed. What do you do with that? And I think that's really what we are talking about. Small and medium enterprises have been hit. Corporations, the airline sector has been hit. The economy, the whole economy has been hit.
So this really poses quite a challenge for the official sector in its response, and of course the private sector as well. But Dan, let me turn to you here. You spent a lot of years in public service, including at the U.S. Treasury and the Inter-American Development Bank. Talk us through this landscape on what official creditors are doing and what they might do going forward, and how does it compare to previous crises?
Happy to try, Sonia. First, I want to thank you, the IIF, for inviting me out to this panel, which is a real pleasure to be with longtime friends and colleagues like Dave and Vera. So, as you're probably aware, the rich countries so far have mobilized resources of somewhere between 5 and 10% of GDP to combat the crisis, and probably much more is likely to come. And rich countries' central banks have mobilized even larger resources in various forms of liquidity and credit backstops. As a share of GDP, and for the reasons that Vera just mentioned, I think governments in less developed countries are likely to need just as much, if not much, much more. But many are facing this crisis in a relatively weaker position than the last one that hit the global economy in 2008, whether in terms of larger fiscal and current account deficits on average and larger pre-existing debt stocks. So many, perhaps most, will also have balance of payments problems and exchange rate stress on top of shortages of fiscal resources. And frankly, I think it's going to be very difficult to mobilize resources of this magnitude, and I don't see transfers from the official sector meeting these needs on their own. From what we hear, some 90 countries have already approached the IMF. Now, the IMF has plenty of resources for emerging markets and the less developed economies. It has approximately $1 trillion in resources overall. And it's been using its emergency facility, the RFI, and then the RCF, which is targeted at poorer countries, aggressively to meet these immediate financial needs. In fact, 2 days ago, the IMF managing director announced a doubling of these emergency facilities to $100 billion. But these facilities, while fast dispersing, are capped at 100% of each country's IMF quota. And most developing countries have a quota that's only about 1% of GDP. Now, countries can follow up by augmenting their existing traditional IMF programs if they already have one in place, or they can enter into a new IMF program. And although these are scaled by quota, IMF programs can exceed a country's quota if conditions justify. And here they probably will from the perspective of need. That said, IMF programs normally focus on stabilizing balance of payments problems, not on providing fiscal support, but they can be adjusted to allow for increased budget spending on a country's COVID response. I think in this sense, it would be a relaxing of conditionality, which seems to me perfectly appropriate given the context. But a thornier problem, and probably more of a binding constraint, is that the ability of the fund to offer a program and its size is subject to a determination by the IMF that a country's debt is sustainable and that the fund will be repaid. Now, the logic is that the resources being lent belong to a membership's central banks. Yet under these circumstances, with uncertainty about the duration of the health crisis, uncertainty about the depths of the recession, uncertainty about the capacity of fiscal systems to service debt, and uncertainty about exchange rates and the terms of trade, any debt sustainability analysis will have extraordinary uncertainty too. So these debt sustainability analyses, more than ever, are going to be art more than science. And the assumptions in the model might be framed as heroic guesswork to get to the desired outcome of actually having a program. Even so, I think the tendency will be to reduce the size of the programs that are ultimately agreed, especially when debt sustainability looks fragile. Now, for their part, the multilateral development banks have much smaller firepower than the IMF. For example, the World Bank lends about $25 billion a year from its ordinary capital resources and about $22 billion in concessional funds from its IDA facilities. The 5 largest borrowers of the World Bank take up about some 40% of ordinary resources, and in no case are these lines a major source of funding for their borrowers, which are the biggest emerging markets. The concessional funds from IDA for the poorer countries are divided up amongst, you said 76 countries. And when you consider net resource transfers, that is taking into account the debt service paid back to the bank, and the resource transfers ultimately then become in the single-digit billions. So these institutions will be mostly relevant only to the smaller countries in their COVID response. I think it's also very unlikely that either the IMF or the multilateral development banks will increase their net resource contributions by offering debt service holidays to their borrowers. To do so would conflict with their longstanding practices of never restructuring debt, which is central to their status as so-called preferred creditors, as well as their standing as AAA institutions in the capital markets. The IFI's role in financial crisis is generally widely considered to be too important to the international financial system to risk that AAA. More likely, I think, are going to be targeted operations, obviously a greater focus on public health systems, which can be achieved by reprogramming existing and undispersed project loans into fiscal support operations. I think we can expect short-term emergency lending facilities, at perhaps higher interest rates for the EM sovereigns, not so for the IDA sovereigns, and the DFIs that focus on the and perhaps guarantees on sovereign bonds for countries that struggle to access the market without them, as well as other operations that more broadly seek to catalyze private sector financial flows. Like those that do the sovereign lending, the DFIs that focus on private sector clients are also going to be too small to provide a systemic impact in most countries. Their businesses are also tending towards pro-cyclicality. That said, they can be helpful, as they were in the 2008 crisis, by providing emergency support for trade credit, working capital lines for banks and for corporate borrowers, risk-sharing programs for corporates that need to hedge their liabilities, and on protecting the financial viability of their existing clients. But I think at this stage, it's very, very difficult for them to originate new business in this crisis environment, especially in countries most in need. It takes time to develop these relationships, whether it's with new clients, and time to perform the due diligence that's necessary for them to make loans. So let me stop there, and I think we can get to the issues around more debt holidays and debt moratoria later.
Thanks very much, Dan. Dave, let me bring you in here. Dan's really outlined some of the challenges for the multilaterals and official creditors. And how do you see the sequencing of what needs to be done for this crisis response? We've got money going out to vulnerable countries, emergency facilities, debt relief. We have enough scale and a well-functioning system to take us through the next 12 to 18 months.
Yes, Sonia. So first of all, thank you for hosting this. And I also want to thank IIF for taking a leadership role on this issue. Lastly, I want to thank IIF for bringing the band back together. I first had the pleasure of working with Dan during the tequila crisis, which was just a few years ago. So just a couple points on what Dan and Vera have said. I think Vera laid it out very well. This is both a healthcare crisis, a crisis of domestic demand as more and more countries go into lockdown, and then a global economic and financial crisis. I think the most important priority right now is to get resources to countries that need it the most. I can agree completely with Vera that I worry about the least developed economies. You've seen how hard advanced economies have gotten hit. And I worry that some of the least developed economies don't have the public healthcare systems, don't have the social safety nets to protect some of the most vulnerable populations and small businesses. So the benefit of a debt standstill is it's fast. If you have debt coming due, you don't have to pay it. The problem with the debt standstill, as opposed to providing new money through a lot of the facilities that Dan talked about, is it basically transfers most of the resources, not necessarily to the countries that are going to be hit hardest by the virus, not necessarily to the countries or sectors that we need to get resources to stop the spread of the virus. It basically channels resources to countries that have accumulated the most debt. I think there's kind of good and bad of what came out of the G20. I think it's good that it looks like this process is going to be debtor-driven. So the G20 communique made clear that a debtor has to request debt relief. I do worry that it not only included IDA-only countries, but included IDA blend and transition countries. And I worry that there will be domestic political pressure in some of these countries to stop paying debt service when it's not necessarily in their long-term interests. And I do think it's important to use the right terminology. Whatever it said in the G20 communique, whatever people are saying, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's a duck. So countries are going to have to decide whether it's in their interest to default to private creditors. Moody's has made it very clear that if you don't pay interest or principal that's due, you are defaulting. For some countries, that makes a lot of sense and it's the right thing to do. There are other countries where it doesn't make sense. Take Mongolia, for example. Mongolia, 90% of its exports go to China. The Chinese economy is coming back slowly. Mongolia doesn't have any external debt service on its sovereign bonds coming due for a year. And, Dan talked about debt sustainability analysis, but kind of given Mongolia's natural resources, it's hard to argue that Mongolia doesn't have a sustainable debt position. I don't think it makes sense for a country like Mongolia to default on its debt by not paying a modest amount of interest and kind of lose market access for what could be a long time. Obviously, I think the big risk is you don't want this to bleed over into kind of more middle income emerging markets for many of them. And I think Dan put this really well. Private sector finance is a critical part of their crisis response. Indonesia is a 1.2, a $4 trillion economy, whatever exchange rate you want to use. They announced a 3% of GDP fiscal stimulus to deal with the COVID-19 crisis. There is not enough official money in the world to finance Indonesia's crisis response. And Indonesia's domestic financial markets are still too shallow to finance a stimulus like that. Indonesia came out, they raised over $4 billion just a week or two ago. But what you don't want to do is put doubts in private creditors' minds that this debt standstill notion is going to bleed over into some of the more middle income, more credit-worthy economies. That's just going to raise their cost of financing at a moment where they need to borrow as much as possible on the cheapest terms as possible.
Sorry, I think I had a force mute on there. Okay, Dave, thank you very much for those comments. And I wanted to turn to Vera here to get her thoughts, not only on what you've said, but on the G20's actions. I mean, the G20's called for a suspension of debt service payments for the poorest countries upon request. Has the G20 gone far enough? Will there need to be more payment holidays ahead, or maybe a debt jubilee, as civil society says? And what's the risk that it bleed over into higher levels of developing markets, middle-income countries?
Thank you again, Sonia. Thank you. I think that we need to take a step back. And as I listen to Dan, especially in somewhat to Dave as well, we are trying to use all solutions for a problem that requires very innovative solutions. We've never been here before. And when I hear things like, there is market access, there is a huge number of African countries that actually, before we got into this crisis, were very creditworthy, were capable of going to the markets and raising resources. That is very correct. But without any extra non-systemic macroeconomic policy deviations, their yields have doubled because the markets have decided that they are already vulnerable countries. So yes, it's easy to tell me that Indonesia went to the market, but Ghana went to the market a month and a half before the crisis. Ghana's yield prices have already doubled. Ghana hasn't done anything wrong. So I ask the question, why is it that we're already acting like vultures on this economist? If we believe, on the one hand, and we're saying, we're threatening a default, I think that is not the appropriate way and the right conversation to be having. The conversation to be having is to say, we have a good number of African economies today that have done well, that have adopted good macroeconomic policies, and that is the reason why they got the market access in the first place. Now we have a crisis that is not of their making. And because it's not of their making, the US, as you said, has given a 2.2 trillion stimulus to its economy, the European $720 billion. But then we say to the poorest of the poor, no, you have to come back, you have to pay, and you have to be in the markets. And we, by the way, without anything that you've done wrong, have doubled the yields. I think that there is fundamentally a problem there. And we do need to ask the question, where is the governance system that does this? And start from that question. And I think when we start asking those questions, we will realize that there is a very, very asymmetric relationship. And then there is now the scare of, if you do this, you will default. But, we have said this a lot of times about Argentina, but I think that Dan has gone back many times over after having said that we will default and after having had a downgrade in the credit rating. So I think that it's a little bit too much now to start threatening these countries with a default and saying, if you do this, you must default. So my sense is we do need to sit down at the end of this conversation, maybe because we're in it. And that's why we're asking for a standstill. There needs to be a review and a revisit of the international financial systems to understand just exactly how we got here and how we get out in a way that is probably a little bit more symmetric to the conversation that we're having. I think that the G20 has gone far. They have not gone far enough. In Africa, we have only 25%. So, Sonia, when you started your introduction and Dan referred to it, when we did HIPC, 75% of African countries were in the poorest country category. Today, there are only 25% of the GDP of Africa is in that category, 25%. So when you give debt relief to 25%, you still have 75% of the economy that you must lift up. And we do need market access for that part of the economy. This conversation is not about whether we need to build back better with market access or without market access. It's a conversation about what do we do in the interim, in this short-term period, where we need to understand how deep is the crisis. We want to honor our obligations. And I think, Sonia, you said it right. And the G20 did that as well, to say we're going to make everybody whole eventually. And there are different ways of doing that. My sense is, again, I go back to this question and call for creativity and innovation. What is it that we can do? Maybe we issue a new bond that buys back everything that's in the market in the commercial space, wrapped around by a AAA credit from one of the banks. And essentially, you make yourselves whole. But again, I think, as David said, and that's really the key to this conversation, is these countries need resources right away. You mentioned Mongolia. Egypt, $6.5 billion of stimulus it has just injected into the economy to keep it going. The economies are themselves already trying to make sure that they can create a certain buffer to what is happening. But let's look at what is the alternative to, we're going to make you default. It's an unruly, disorderly default process that the markets are going to have to deal with. Is that what we're looking for? Because that's, I think, what we would expect, from, and we need, I think, a critical spokesman or spokes group from this community, is to say, let's sit down and say the option is disorderly debt defaults, or we have a consortium, as in the IMF and the World Bank, and maybe they should be the ones who bring together these private creditors and sit together and say, this is what we do and this is how we do it. And we come up with a few new and innovative solutions. Right now, what we're saying is we want a debt standstill for all of Africa, not just for IDA. Remember, IDA is 25%, for all of Africa. And we are willing to consider and sit with the markets and say, we'll make you whole, exactly as the G20 has said. And there are different methodologies. We can create an SPV. We can create a new bond that we issue out and then pay back with it. So I think there are different ways of doing that. And this is the time for us to be creative. This is the time for us to say, first, we want to save lives. We want to make sure, again, also that there is peace and stability in a lot of these countries that have just after come from a huge buildup. Tunisia, I don't think that the question for Tunisia today is a threat of a default. The question for Tunisia today is, how can we make sure that you don't keep going deeper and that we can help you build back better? And what conditions for market access can we give you?
So, Vera, you raised some really challenging questions and some interesting potential innovative solutions. But Dan, let me get your reaction here. Do you think the G20 has gone far enough? And David mentioned the private sector is an essential part of the equation here. Should private sector creditors' participation be required? And how might that be done? And what could be the repercussions?
Well, first of all, I think that it is overall a positive thing that the G20 has announced a suspension owed to bilateral creditors. And I think it's also very important that this debt holiday has included China, which is by far the largest bilateral creditor to the IDA countries, with claims estimated at some 10% of GDP on average, and more than twice the claims of all the other Paris Club members combined. So that's a good thing. And I also want to give a shout out to Vera, who, as executive secretary of UNECA, helped to organize the African finance ministers to call for the debt holiday. And I'm sure that these voices resonated strongly when the G20 considered this proposal. But so, I think a reasonable question is, if it's such a good idea to have offered this bilateral official debt holiday, why shouldn't it be extended more broadly? Both to more countries and to more creditors. Now, I've already explained that doing so with the multilaterals would compromise longstanding policy, which give these institutions de facto seniority, and that this so-called preferred creditor status enables them to be a lender of last resort in a crisis and a first resort coming out of one. That said, I do think there is some scope for creating a debt service fund for the multilateral development bank creditors that can't provide debt holidays, along the lines of what exists at the IMF, a fund called the CCRT. The G20 and other bilateral donors could provide seed capital to get it started, and then the MDBs could contribute with operating income to support amortizations due to their own institutions. Borrowing countries could, in effect, borrow their debt service from the fund and repay it with a premium later, and the poorer countries could receive resources from the fund on a grant basis, as they do now with the CCRT and IDA resources more generally. So I think that's something that can be done with respect to multilateral debt service. But back to your original question about expanding debt holidays, in announcing their own debt holiday, the G20 did suggest that private creditors offer the same deferral on their debt service due. I think that there's a number of reasons why this would be a bad idea. I do worry about it bleeding too broadly. I don't think that this is a question of blame or lack of blame. I think it's a question of pure self-interest on the part of the debtor countries to do what makes sense for them. And I think it makes I think they've got to be very careful about what they ask for in this highly volatile and uncertain environment. The first reason is that some countries simply don't need debt forbearance. They have the necessary fiscal buffers. They have access to financial reserves. They have the capacity to raise capital from both official and private sources, foreign and domestic, to get through this crisis. At least as it might appear to them now. Now, I think it's highly likely that many countries will exit this crisis with too much debt that they cannot and will not repay, more than may appear to be vulnerable to insolvency right now. But that's a problem for another day. And meanwhile, I think it would be counterproductive to jeopardize access to commercial sources of finance by asking for short-term debt holidays from private creditors. The global capital markets have already reopened for the BBB or better sovereign borrowers, and it's robust for high-grade corporates in the developed world. I think it's quite likely that the sub-investment grade borrowers, sovereign borrowers, will soon regain access too. Now, while these countries, of course, should borrow from as much as they can from lower-cost IFIs and the export credit agencies, as I've mentioned above, official sources of finance will not be sufficient to meet their resource needs. So they need to tap market sources as well for as much as they can. I think the second reason they should think twice about asking for forbearance from private sector creditors is that it could disrupt credit to their private sectors. Credit that is received via interbank lines, working capital facilities to corporates, and trade finance. Foreign banks and other types of creditors would certainly be prompted to downgrade a country seeking a holiday in its internal risk, in all of our internal risk models. They'd probably lower the country ceilings, they'd curtail new flows, and they'd raise pricing because of the risks that debt holidays could be extended, they could be expanded, they could become more permanent, or they could, be the first step to a restructuring. What's more, the major rating agencies would likely respond to any debt service suspension done on a non-voluntary basis as an indication of selective default. So social isolation policies have certainly caused enough economic disruption and damage without compounding the problem by imposing a sudden loss of private sector credit to those countries that still have it, and most do in one form or another. I think there's also some extremely complicated implementation issues that a debt holiday strategy has to address for it to be effective. As Dave alluded to it, what are the rules of eligibility? Should only poor countries be eligible? Seems not. What about middle-income countries that have weaker fiscal systems or weaker debt sustainability? Would countries be allowed to opt out? As Dave said, some countries don't need it, including in Africa. What creditors would be allowed to opt out? And if not, how is the legal definition of default avoided? Which instruments should be included? Why, we've already discussed why IFI loans are not likely to be included, but bilateral official credits are. And that makes sense. They're not market sensitive. But Eurobonds, I think that would cancel any hope of a country re-entering the capital markets until after the holiday was over, and possibly much longer thereafter. Commercial credits like the trade and interbank lines would be disrupted and cause a repricing of normal commercial flows and working capital facilities that are already threatened and more expensive because of the crisis. And then the question is, should local law instruments be included? In most countries, public sector indebtedness is now attributable more to local law instruments than foreign law. And, many foreigners also participate in the local markets. So if local law isn't included in the holiday, it's really hard to justify a holiday for one class of private creditor and not those, that use them. And if local law instruments are included, it implies a need to close the capital account, lest the resources saved from the debt holiday are used to finance capital flow. So, doing all of this could wreak havoc on local banks and other institutions that own local government bonds. And then, just to throw up another category of indebtedness, what about sovereign guarantees that support infrastructure projects, such as guarantees on offtake agreements? If these are included, privately financed infrastructure investment might come to a halt. And right now, infrastructure deals in the emerging markets are still getting done. Would any of these countries that receive a holiday require an IMF program? And if not, who would monitor a country's expenditure programs in order that creditors can be assured that resources saved during the holiday are actually used to good effect in fighting the crisis? So in short, I think there are relatively few cases where a debt holiday from the private sector makes sense or even should be requested right now at this time of high volatility and vulnerability. And those cases where it does make sense are likely to be those where default is imminent anyway. And the country is going to have to begin the painful process of a restructuring. For most other countries, I think it's better to keep all sources of capital flowing to the maximum extent possible and to deal with the debt sustainability problems later, after the dust has settled.
Well, Dan, you have laid out a number of incredibly difficult questions, so it's just as well that we have key commercial creditor and source of private credit, Dave, here to be able to answer them. But Dave, what are your perspectives on what Dan and Vera have said? You are one of these investors. Bondholders are far more important in the creditor base these days.
Yeah, thanks, Sonia. I do want to respond to Vera. It's not like we're threatening countries with default. It's just acknowledging the reality that workouts with private creditors take a long time. They're very complicated. And for the next 6 months, I don't think officials, either multilateral officials or officials in some of the hardest hit countries, should be spending hours and hours in negotiations working out deals with private creditors. So the reality for the next 6 months is countries will have to decide whether to service their debt. For many IDA countries, not servicing their debt will be the right decision. And as a creditor, we understand that and are happy to work with countries. That will be considered a default by the credit rating agencies. And that's an issue we're going to have to deal with later. I also completely agree with Vera that essentially the system is broken. And once we get over the immediate crisis period, as we get into next year, we're going to have to kind of work twice as hard to come up with a mechanism, particularly as countries are going to have a lot more senior debt from the IMF and other multilateral institutions on their books. I think the fundamental problem is the system that kind of governs sovereign debt fundamentally hasn't changed that much since Dan and I were working together on Mexico. And there are two big changes. One, obviously, Dan and I have a bit more gray hair. But secondly, the Paris Club and the traditional multilateral creditors have become increasingly irrelevant. And Dan has mentioned this, but take Pakistan. Paris Club creditors and traditional IMF, Multilateral Development Bank creditors account for less than a third of Pakistan's debt service. And I think the challenge we all face is we were dragging our heels for years, thinking we could have our cake and eat it too, thinking we could deny other creditors, particularly China, but other emerging market creditors like Saudi Arabia. We thought we could deny them getting a greater weight in the governance of some of the critical institutions, IMF, World Bank, Paris Club, and then think that traditional creditors that account for an increasingly small share of credit to many emerging markets can dictate the terms to these other creditors. I'm highly skeptical that's going to happen. And I just want to temper people's expectations. We've been working through private sector involvement issues for decades. It's very hard. There's a lot of legal issues dealing with holdouts. We weren't able to solve some of these issues when we had very strong global leadership, when we had strong multilateral institutions that were viewed as having a lot of legitimacy. We are in a different world today. The world is moving away from multilateralism. And I also think the world is moving away from providing more financial resources through the official donor community. So again, this is going to be an issue that we can't ignore in 2021 and 2022, but I just want to temper people's expectations.
Well, we are, in fact, approaching the end of our time here. Clearly, we should have allowed another couple of hours for this discussion. And you brought us out on a rather somber note, Dave. But I want to thank all of our panelists, Vera and Dan and Dave, for a very thoughtful discussion. We'll have it up on the web for replay. And perhaps people could join me in a round of virtual applause for this very excellent discussion. So with that, I think that brings our sessions to a close today. Thank you all for being with us, and we hope that you found the discussions useful and meaningful.